Welcome to The Smart Divorce on Divorce Source Radio, helping you move forward with focus, hope, and confidence, saving you time, money, and your sanity as you build a better life post-divorce. I'm Steve Peck. Deborah Moskovitch, divorce consultant, educator, and author of The Smart Divorce, brings you the leading experts and researchers in the divorce arena. We'll also be speaking with those in the trenches, people who've learned from their divorce and how their experience has changed their lives. And they would tell you for the better. Deborah's learned that divorce can be a beginning, even if it looks like an end. Divorce can be rich in opportunity to learn and grow from. And we're going to explore how to take this information and create a positive post-divorce life. And now, here's Deborah.
Hi, Steve. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome back. You've been on hiatus for a couple of weeks. It's good to have you back on the air.
I have to tell you, to be quite honest, I really miss doing the show with you. I absolutely love helping our listeners understand the divorce process, educating, and generally talking about divorce with you.
Well, you've been missed too, and we kick off this new series with a great guest, Dr. Joan Kelly.
She is an internationally recognized expert on divorce, and I have to tell you something, I don't think you could really get any higher in terms of the divorce world, getting that wonderful information about children of divorce. I consider Dr. Joan Kelly as the rock star of divorce. She can give you so much wise advice in terms of any subject pertaining to children divorce. And she's fabulous. She's been very helpful to me in terms of a lot of the work that I'm doing. And I have learned so much. It's over. I am just very honored that Dr. Kelly is going to be our guest today. But I want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you remember telling your son about your divorce?
Oh, boy. You had to ask that.
Because that's what we're going to talk about today.
How to tell the kids? Well, I did it the wrong way. My relationship got a little contentious and kind of blew up. So I didn't have the opportunity to do it right. So I'm very, very curious to hear the right way from Dr. Kelly.
Well, I will tell you that I didn't necessarily do everything about my divorce smart either, which is why I wrote The Smart Divorce. I wanted to understand what that meant. But I did talk to a parenting expert to understand what it is that I should be saying to my children. Now, they were 1, 3, and 7 at the time, so I really needed to be scripted for my older child and how I was going to handle that conversation. And I have to tell you something that made me feel really good that I made that effort. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life to sit down and, tell my child that his life was going to change. It's going to be impacted quite dramatically. But boy, was I ever glad I did it.
Did you do it alone or with your ex?
I did it alone. Now, it's interesting because we will ask Dr. Kelly about that. And most parenting experts would tell you, or all parenting experts would tell you, that the best thing to do is for parents to sit down together and tell their children. But you know what? It's not always possible. In my case, it was not possible. But you know what? I wasn't going to live a lie. I think it was so important. Kids are pretty smart, and they see and they observe. And I certainly think that my older one knew that there was something going on. And to just live like that without helping him be informed, I couldn't do that to my child. One of the things that was my greatest fear, and we know that children live out the divorce, is how do you minimize the impact of divorce on children? Right. And there are 3 messages that you need to provide your children. A, divorce is not their fault. B, that you love them very much. And C is to provide them with that sense of stability. Well, if you say nothing, you're not going to make them feel that, the divorce is not their fault or the separation is not their fault. What's going on around them is maybe my parents don't love me anymore. There's a huge sense of confusion. And also, in terms of stability and comfort level, if you don't sit down and tell your kids, you're not they're not going to feel all that. So although I couldn't tell my son with, my co-parent, his father, I thought it was really important to do on my own. And that's why I sought the help of a parenting expert. And I'm telling you, it was the best thing I did. And it was probably one of the wisest investments throughout my whole divorce.
So the good news for our listeners is you're going to get the information from one of the nation's leading researchers. And we're going to have Dr. Joan Kelly join us right now. Dr. Kelly, welcome to The Smart Divorce on Divorce Source Radio.
Thank you.
Today I want to talk about Dr. Kelly's fabulous book, which I got from AAML, which is the Association of American Matrimonial Lawyers, and it's called "What Should We Tell the Children? A Parent's Guide for Talking About Separation and Divorce." And Dr. Kelly, I read somewhere the statistic that you said that 5% of parents actually sit down and tell their children about the divorce. I was shocked.
Well, I was shocked actually too when I read that study. And there are other figures that were equally concerning. For example, they found that about 45% of parents who do say something to their children only use one line, like "your dad's leaving" or "your mother's gone." And that was the end of it. There was no further discussion with the children.
Oh my God.
It's a very small group of parents who actually collect themselves together, either separately or together, or talk with the kids about what's about to happen and give them a chance to ask some questions.
Why do you think that happens? Why don't they tell their kids?
Well, why does it happen? I think it happens in part because parents are themselves emotionally upset the most of the time, and they don't know what to say to their children about the pending separation and divorce, and they're afraid that their children will react in negative ways to the news, and so they just don't do it.
Well, we're very lucky to have you on the show because I'd love for you to share the scripting, your thoughts, what parents should do. So how do we help that other 95% of parents to sit down, or encourage those 95% of parents to sit down and talk to their kids? So let's start at the top. What should parents do to start that conversation?
Well, first of all, I think that parents, again, either individually or separately, depending on whether they can talk to each other at this point, they need to sit down themselves and think about, what is it that I want my children to hear? What is it that I need to say to the children? And among the things that they do need to talk about with the children are, one, sort of what is going to happen and when is this going to happen. If somebody knows that they're going to separate in a month, they may not tell their children a whole month in advance because that can be a very tense time. But typically, older kids, for example, need some advance notice about what's going on, and that the parents do plan to separate. Children need to find out, how will this affect me? I mean, that's really the central issue here, is that most children, because they aren't really told very much about what's going to happen, they fill in all the blanks with the worst fears and anxiety. They're really scared because they don't know what this means to them when a parent says, we're going to get a divorce or we're going to separate. And we know that children, just like adults, react better to a crisis if they have good, solid information about what's going to happen next and how this is going to affect them. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, well, I'd love for you to provide us with some ideas about the scripting and the language.
Well, the scripting and the language depends on how old the children are. The younger children, for example, those under the age of 6, really need to have very concrete language used by their parents. It's not, for example, with a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old, very effective to say, your dad and I are getting a divorce, because a lot of 3-year-olds don't know what the word divorce is a big adult word. What they really need to hear are words that describe they're actually going to experience. So your dad and I are going to live in two different houses is a kind of language that you would want to use with a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. And you can use the word divorce eventually, but to say we're not going to be living in the same house anymore, mommy or daddy is moving to a different place, and then you continue to go on and talk about what's going to happen. I mean, the things that children need to hear without the script with it are, where are each of the parents going to live? And kids want to know, where am I going to live and what's going to happen to their stuff? Kids also want to know whether it's okay to love each parent. So, parents, for example, need to say to their children, just because daddy and I, or just because your mom and I are separating or getting a divorce, that doesn't mean that we're divorcing you. I think a lot of adults think why do we have to say this? It should be obvious. But it's not obvious to children. And when parents are so angry with each other, children really begin to feel like, they're not going to be able to love one of their parents, or one of their parents is not going to, love them. And so they need to be reassured, even though your mom and I are going to get a divorce, nothing changes. I'm always your mom, and your dad is always your dad, and we will always love you and be your parent. Very concrete, very important information for them to hear. And kids need to know things like, well, who's going to continue to who's going to take care of them? A little 4-year-old, the parents were telling her about the separation, and they had prepared and they had consulted with me about what to say to their 4-year-old and their 2-year-old. And they got through the whole thing. She said, but who's going to take care of me? It's a central issue, particularly for young children.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them, they told her that her babysitter and her, would continue to take care of her during the day, and that mommy and daddy, or we, are still going to take care of you when each of us are with you. I can ramble on here. There's a lot of information.
I think it's so important. I think the first thing, though, Dr. Kelly, don't you agree that parents should tell their children together if they can?
It is preferable for parents to sit down first, work out what it is that they're going to say. If necessary, actually write down the things that each of them want and need to say, and sort of create their own script. Because people are so anxious about this that it's easy to forget. And so if parents make a list of the things that they want to say and then sort of divide them up, and then find a time when the kids are like not rushing off to soccer or just ready to start a big homework assignment, but find a time when they can sit down with them. It's not like it takes 2 hours. It can be a 15-minute thing. It can be even 10 minutes. It depends on the family and how much communication has existed in the family about talking about things. Doing it together is preferable, because then the kids hear the same thing and the parents are assured of what each other is saying it. Doing it separately is necessary when there's been violence, when the conflict is so high that one or the other parent can't trust that they're going to keep themselves under control, because it's important for parents not to shout and scream and yell while they're talking to their kids. Where there's been substance abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, where there's mental illness, those are special circumstances that would require generally that the healthier parent would first sit down and talk with the kids, and then maybe work with the other parent about what to say.
And what do you tell parents? I often hear from my own clients saying, I didn't want this divorce, or, my spouse had the affair and so they're leaving. What do you tell those parents to tell their children?
Well, children do not need to know the gritty details of why parents are separating. And it's not helpful to children to hear, I'm leaving, your dad had an affair, or whatever. or I'm leaving, your mom's a druggie.
Yeah.
Children, here's the main principle. When you talk with the children, it's really important not to destroy the child's relationship with either parent. Children may eventually come to some understanding that one parent has some serious limitations, but that's typically because they come to that understanding themselves over time by living with each of these parents separately. So the principle is what you say can have a really big impact on your children, so you want to choose your words carefully and be respectful of the fact that the child almost always loves both parents and almost always wants to continue to have a relationship with each of his or her parents. Now, sometimes kids have seen things in the marriage that are the clues for parents about what to say. So if there's been a lot of argument and fighting, there's been a lot of yelling, parents can use that because their children have seen it, they've been frightened by it, they don't like it. And so parents can say to the children, you've seen us argue, you've seen us fight, you've seen us get so angry at each other that it's hard to control ourselves. And either we or I've decided that that's not a good way for us to live. It's not good for you to see that or hear that. And so we've tried to work things out. We went to a counselor, whatever the details are in a family, then to say, but we weren't able to work this out. And so we have decided, or I have decided, that it's better if we live separately and apart. And hopefully at some point we can have a friendly relationship and not yell and scream at each other.
No.
Does that make sense to you?
Sure. What I wonder is there ever a time when you want to do this with a counselor so that you've got a third party to kind of help tell this story?
Well, that's a good question. Let me back up. Your question is good, and let me back up 1 minute. I actually think that it's very helpful for parents to sit down before they tell their kids with either a mediator, if they're using a mediator, or a marriage or family counselor if they've used one of those. And if it's somebody who knows a lot about divorce and children and how to talk to children, and sort of help. I used to do a lot of this myself as a divorce mediator. Parents would come in before they separated and tell me that they plan to separate, and then ask me, how should we tell the children? And so we would together craft the reasons that they both could agree to, craft a kind of script, decide when they're going to do it, and then they would go off, and in the next week or so, they would tell their children. Sometimes it's hard to find a person like that. They have to be professionals who understand that preschool children, for example, need very concrete language. They have to understand how to deal with the anger of older kids. Sometimes adolescents and children, 10 to 12, are actually very angry when their parents tell them. Part of that anger is because they're afraid, and it erupts as anger. But if they can find the right person that they trust and who knows a lot about children and knows sort of the details of what the children need to know, I think it can be very helpful. Now, your question, should you do it with a counselor? I think the same thing applies. If the counselor was your therapist who really doesn't specialize in talking with children, doing therapy or counseling with children, it may or may not be a good idea because that person is a stranger to the child. But I think that's an individual decision. Parents if they feel like they need help, they should go out and find the right person to help them.
And I guess one of the ways that a parent can go out and find those resources is asking their family law lawyer if they've started to work with a lawyer.
Yes, they can, if the family lawyer has those kinds of resources. Many of the very experienced family law lawyers who work exclusively in the divorce and child custody area do have people that they know are good at doing this, people who do custody evaluations, people who do child therapy, people who specialize in seeing families during and after divorce. So, yeah, that's a good person to ask. And otherwise, ask around.
Yeah, I think that's so helpful. How do you help your children if they saw a loving relationship? Like if there's conflict, it's easy for children to understand why mommy and daddy can't live together anymore. But when there's a loving relationship, when everything was really hush-hush and behind closed doors, how do you help your children see that there was a problem in the relationship and mommy and daddy might still love each other, but they can't live together anymore?
That seems harder.
Well, that's difficult. The fact is, I would say it's fairly unusual that both parents still love each other, excuse me.
Right.
It is more typical that one parent is still in love with the other parent, and is very upset about the separation. But I think that I will also say that if the parents say to the child, we're divorcing, but we still love each other, it's a pretty difficult message for children to deal with. It's, well, if you love each other, why are you doing this?
Mm-hmm.
It makes no sense at all. Adolescents say, well, that's really stupid,
Yeah.
But I think the for me, better language is to say, we've been very unhappy with each other. We just, don't get along. We've tried to be friends with each other and in front of you, but it's hard to stay together when you feel very unhappy with your partner all the time. And so, I think it's okay for a parent to say, I made the decision to separate. It was my decision because I decided it was going to be better for all of us if we separated. But parents can say, when we got married, we loved each other. But now we don't, if that's true,
Right.
And many things change. We've changed, We love you dearly. That's never going to change. We're always going to be your mom and your dad. So it's a harder message, when the children have seen a civilized partnership. The fact is, a lot of parents, the reason for their divorce is that there's been a gradual growing apart, a loss of love, a loss of intimacy, and they've been living in a more platonic relationship that no longer holds sort of emotional value for one or both parents. And that's a fairly common reason that parents decide to separate. And that's a harder one for kids to deal with because what they saw was a pretty good relationship, and they often saw some good parenting on the part of the parents, so they don't get it.
So does that mean that it affects their outlook on what relationships or what good relationships are? Because all of a sudden they realize, nothing is for sure anymore.
Yeah, sounds very confusing.
Well, I think that particularly probably with teenagers and preteens, I think that it may inject some doubt in terms of, if I thought they had a good relationship, how can I trust any of my own relationships?
Right.
That is an issue. And the other thing that I want to say is that a parent doesn't have to complete this whole process of telling the children about the divorce in the first sitting. What I've learned in dealing with people, and from the research that we did years ago, was that the parents would tell the children, and the kids would react, sometimes crying, sometimes upset, anxious, sometimes very angry, and then they sort of go away and begin to think about it, and maybe they then circle back and say, well, but what's that part about? I don't get what you're saying about this, and then somebody can explain again. So they keep kind of filling in their questions. And so telling the children about the separation and or the divorce is a process that goes on over time. It's not a one-time event. And I think that's a really important thing for parents to understand.
Yeah, absolutely.
As children continue to have questions, as they kind of come to grips with the reality of what's going on. Now, you asked me to talk about scripting.
Yeah.
When they talk to the kids. I mean, I think it's important for kids to have parents say initially, for now, you're not going to change schools. You'll still be able to go to the same school. You still have your same friends. We still have your same activities. You can still play soccer or hockey. And so for the next 6 months or a year, nothing's going to change. After that, we may need to move, but we don't know yet. But it's okay to tell children that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes parents have to move fairly quickly because of resource issues, of not having enough money, that they have a lot of money tied up in a house, for example. But if they don't know, they can say, we don't yet know what's going to happen, but certainly if we can, we want you to be able to stay in the same school and be able to do all the things you're currently doing. So that's an important thing for kids to hear. They need to hear if they're taking, piano and they really like it. We both plan that you're still going to see Miss Jones, and as your piano teacher. And so what the kids need to hear is, will there be anything that's stable? Will anything be the same? Does everything change? What parts of my life will stay the same, at least for now, and what parts will change? And also parents can say to kids, if we do move, it's not going to be like to another city. If we move across town, we'll make sure that you still get to see your best friends and so on. We'll make that happen for you. And of course, you hope that the parents keep their promises.
Right, absolutely. Should parents have a parenting plan, sort of like an interim parenting plan prepared before this discussion?
It's really helpful if the parents sort of know what's, several things. If they know where one of the parents is going to live, if somebody's moving out, it's helpful if they have some idea of what the parenting plan, or in other words, the plan for how much time the children will spend with each parent and when they'll be over at each parent's house. On the other hand, so that they can tell the kids that, so that they might be able to say at that first or second meeting, your dad's going to be moving out. He's finding an apartment right now, and in fact, it's better for Dad to talk about this. Look, I'm looking for an apartment right now, and as soon as I find one that I think is going to work, I'm going to bring you over. We're going to look at it together, and that's where then you'll come and be with me on weekends and Wednesday nights after school and overnight, etc. So, to the extent that parents can give that kind of lay of the land to their children, that's beneficial. On the other hand, a lot of parents haven't worked out their parenting plan. It's either too new, the whole separation, or it's too contentious. Because somebody's very angry and they say, if you think you're going to see the kids, forget it, or well, I'm going to go see the kids so you can just forget seeing them. I mean, in very angry moments, it means that that they're not going to be able to work this out. They're going to have to use lawyers, go to court, represent themselves, or get their own lawyers, go to mediation, depending on where they live. Hopefully they can go to a mediator, and then if they need to, use a lawyer. So if they don't have a plan, I think it's best to say, your dad and I, your mom and I, we haven't figured out yet what nights you'll be with your mom and what nights you'll be with your dad. And we'll just have to work that out as we go along. But we want you to know you will continue to be with your mom and you'll continue to be with your dad. We just haven't figured out exactly when that is. Does that make sense to you, Deborah?
Absolutely.
To say it that way. I mean, you want honesty with respect to, we haven't worked out all the details. And then I'm sorry about that. I think it's important for parents to say, when we work out these things, we will tell you about it, okay? And if you have questions, you can ask us. So the kind of a transparency about planning and about the child's future is really important. Transparency about why we're getting a divorce and all of the juicy details, are not what kids should hear. So there's quite a difference here in terms of being honest about what this means for the children, as opposed to being brutally honest about why a parent decides to divorce. Parents can find a more dignified way to tell their children about what's going on. I used an example in this booklet about a dad who says to his child, "You remember when Mom went to the center because she was having a big problem with using drugs, and then she came back and things are going well, and I was really happy about that, but now she's having trouble again, and I've decided this is not a good way for you to live and for me to live." So the father in that instance is using the child's experience of the mother having gone to a treatment center to try to shake the drug habit, meanwhile saying, in a sense, she relapsed, and I'm worried about your future, which is what a lot of parents would be.
Right, and don't you find, like, children are very smart, and I find that sometimes parents don't give their children, the kids credit enough for how astute they really are?
Children are smart. I think a better way to say it is that children are very good observers of their family life.
Yeah.
And we have some research about that these children, they're good observers of how parents interact with and treat each other. They're good observers of how mom parents us, what mom does with us, of how dad deals with us and is a parent to us. They are remarkably astute observers, and so you're right. A lot of this they know. Maybe the labels weren't put on it. Maybe when she went to the drug treatment center the first time, Dad said, "Mom's having trouble and she needs to get some special help." But a lot of kids would somehow figure that out. By the way, I didn't say at the beginning, one of the reasons it's important to tell children early on, as soon as there's a decision to separate, is that you don't want kids to find out about this from a neighbor's child or from somebody at school. I mean, that's just not fair to children to have somebody else say, "Oh, I heard your mom and dad are getting divorced." So, that's traumatic for kids. So parents have to step up to the plate and be responsible, craft their thinking and their conversation for kids, and then sit down and do it. It's interesting, when I consulted to parents about what to say to their children, they would set up a time to do that. They would then go off and talk to their kids, and because they were coming to mediation to mediate their divorce, they came the next time, and I asked them, "Did you tell your children about the separation?" And they said yes. And I said, how did that go? And they tell me what happened, and they tell me almost routinely that they're so relieved that they were able to do this and to do it in a civilized way that their children could deal with.
That's great. What about parents that are living separate and apart at home together? Like, I've got many clients who are living together, but they're separated and they haven't told their children yet. Don't you think the kids figure something out when mom and dad aren't sharing the same bed anymore? They're not sharing the same bedroom? Yeah,
that happens. Parents stay in the same house usually for two reasons. One, financial reasons. They really can't afford to have a separate living unit. And secondly, they live in the same house while the separation divorce is proceeding, because they live in a place where the law doesn't protect the person who moves out. So, you have to stay in the house to continue to have sort of, quote, custody rights, And it's unfortunate that that's the case, because it's extremely tense for parents when it's really the law that's saying don't leave the house or you might be at a disadvantage legally. So what do you do about that? I think what you have to do is exactly the same thing. You have to tell the children what's going on. Your dad and I are not getting along, or sitting down together, we aren't getting along. We are thinking about getting a separation, or we are separating. We are going to get divorced. We're going to stay in the same house. We can't afford to live in two separate places. And mom's going to be basically upstairs and I'm going to be downstairs in the family room. Or however they're going to do it, you know.
Right.
Kids notice when a parent moves out of the parent's bedroom and moves across the hall. All kids notice that.
Yeah.
You know, parents hope they don't, but they do. So then the thing to say, the thing to do between the parents is to say what is going to be each of our household responsibilities. That is, you know, are you going to cook and serve dinner some nights a week? Are you going to do some child care part of the weekend? And figure out how they're going to proceed. Because what a number of parents do is they begin to parent separately. And so on Saturday, it's Dad's day to be with the kids, and Mom makes herself scarce.
Right.
She goes out with her friends. She goes take a trip. She goes sees her parents, whatever. And Dad's in charge for the whole day. Mom might come back at bedtime. They also tend to divvy up just responsibilities from the standpoint of who's going to be paying the bills and who's going to, you know, do this and how are we going to take messages for each other. Sort of important things that'll make this go more smoothly. What you don't want is for children to be living in sort of a hostile refrigerator environment, you know, where it's so cold, it's so chilly, when the parents pass each other, that the kids are upset and tense, and particularly if they don't know what's going on. So it's equally important to explain that arrangement, and then to tell kids, you know, once we get closer to the final divorce, we'll sort of know what's going to happen, and at that point one of us will move out or we'll be selling this house. We just don't know any of those details yet.
And, you know, I think that's a gap in the system where, for legal reasons, parents have to stay in the same home together, because is it really in the children's best interest to see their parents living separate and apart in the same home and then splitting their child responsibilities and... You know, and living in that refrigerator environment. I love that.
Beyond the legal implications, you have the financial. A lot of people are living together because of finances. But you mentioned sometimes couples separate within their own house. They're living in different rooms. So the kids are kind of seeing this come down the pipe. Or I've known a lot of couples that have this trial separation. Things aren't working out. So dad says, look, I'm going to get an apartment. We'll live there for 6 months, and we're going to work on this relationship. So the children are able to see that this relationship is pulling apart, and then 6 months later, when the mom and dad sit down and say, honey, it didn't work, maybe they're a little more ready for it.
Well, I think they are more ready for it. I think it's still important to tell the kids what's happening. You know, your mom's going, I mean, it's not always dad that moves out, although it's predominantly so in our society. But to say your dad's actually going to go live with his parents for the next couple months. We're not, you've seen that we're not getting along, and we're thinking about separating, and this is how we're going to do it now for the next couple months, and we'll let you know what happens. We're going to go to a counselor. If we can work it out, that's great. If we can't, we'll just have to see. So, yeah, the kids actually starting at that instant begin to feel like it's not going to happen, that they aren't going to get back together again. But many are very hopeful, of course, and so they keep looking at parents for signs of improvement or signs of civility between them or signs of huge amount of anger. So they're sort of reading the temperature all the time. Right. But, you know, there's no perfect way to separate and divorce as far as kids are concerned. It's typically a difficult time for most kids. It's a crisis, no matter how you're doing it. But what's important here is to help the kids cope with the enormous changes in their life by letting them know as best possible what's happening to them and how this is going to affect the children. And then as things change, to say, look, how are things going with you? Or your mom and I have decided that we're actually going to have to sell this house. Here's what we're thinking now. So keeping kids appraised will help them cope with it a lot.
And I guess that's what you need to do, like, after the conversation, just to keep the conversation opportunities open so that your children are feel comfortable coming back to you with more and more questions.
Well, yeah, and I think parents need to explicitly say to their children, we're just starting this conversation. I hope that as you think of questions or things you're worried about, that you'll come and talk to either one of us, because we know it's difficult, we know it's confusing. So it's good, it's important for parents to make it known that they're open to conversation, even if it's painful. One of the reasons that parents don't want to talk to their kids is they're afraid they'll cry during the conversation, with the initial conversation with their children.
Right.
And my response to that is, it's okay. If you're going to cry, it's okay to cry. And you can say, look, this is upsetting for me. This is not something that I thought we would do, but, here we are. And your kids may cry with you, or they may be alarmed that you're crying, but it's okay because it's exactly honest. And as long as you have this kind of script, it helps you sort of get through so you know sort of how you need to proceed.
Now, what about after the conversation if you start noticing some behavioral changes in your children? What would you advise parents to do at that point?
Well, first of all, parents need to know what to expect with their children. And in this booklet, I only very briefly touch on that because that wasn't the topic here. But there are a lot of good books out there written for parents about children's responses to divorce. And that is their most common responses to separation and divorce. And I use the word separation, by the way, because a number of parents are separating who have lived together but not married.
Mm-hmm.
And that is an equally demanding situation for parents and equally challenging for the children if somebody's lived with a partner for 10 years.
Absolutely.
So that's why I keep using the word separation and or divorce. Now, generally, the responses of children to separation and divorce are somewhat age-related. Adolescents and preteens, kids from 10, 11, and up, are, for example, more likely to be very angry at one, if not both parents, and to feel like, like you've robbed me of my childhood. You're ruining my senior year in high school. So they're angry about it. They are still anxious and fearful. They still need to know just the same thing, but you are more likely to see more acting out and more anger, more shouting on the part of the older kids, and be prepared for that. It's not abnormal. Younger kids, for example, kids 6, 7, 8, are frequently very sad about the separation, and particularly young boys are very sad, sometimes even depressed, because it is the father that most often moves out, and they are very upset that their dad's not around, assuming that dad's been an okay parent and the child, has spent a lot of time with that parent. A lot of the preschool kids, the major issue with children 3 and 4 is that they are more likely to assume that they've done something wrong, that they have caused this divorce. And it has to do with their immature thinking, and the fact that at 3 and 4, children are very egocentric, and they think that the world revolves around them. And so if last week they kicked their mom in the shins during a tantrum, now they think, is it because I kicked you that you're moving out or you're divorcing daddy or whatever? So children at these ages, 3, 4, 5, need to be reassured that that you, in fact, kids of all ages, but especially preschool, there's nothing that you did that caused this. This divorce is not about you. You weren't the reason for this divorce. And sometimes kids will come back around, the 4-year-old, and say, well, maybe daddy left because, I didn't pick up the room when he told me to. So sometimes I'll test it out, and en route to finding out whether, in fact, they caused this divorce. The fact is, while I think the popular myth is that children feel they've caused the divorce,
mm-hmm.
the research doesn't support that. Generally, children, particularly those 7, 8, and up, do not think they've caused their parents' divorce. They, particularly the 8 and ups, 9 to 18-year-olds, they sort of look around them and they get it that there probably are some reasons for this divorce that absolutely have nothing to do with them. They've seen their parents interact. They've seen what's going on, and they don't tend to feel responsible. The children who are most likely to feel guilty and that they've caused the divorce are children who are actually already vulnerable, psychologically in trouble, some of them in therapy. So the more vulnerable children are sort of less resilient and are more likely to feel guilty that they had something to do with it. But all children need reassured. You didn't cause this. This is not about you. This is about your dad and I, or your mom and I.
Right. Dr. Kelly, I could talk to you for hours, months, years. You've got over 40 years of research backing you, and you know so much. So I want to just end with one last question, because I know that it is paramount in every parent's mind, the worry about the negative fallout of divorce. What can parents do to minimize all of the negativity of divorce that you hear about in the media? Pregnancy and drinking and,
You're talking about in the kids themselves?
Yeah.
There is more acting out and, more impulsive behaviors. Yes, kids are more at risk. There's no question about it when their parents divorce. However, we have also learned from research that there are important factors that protect kids from the negative effects of divorce. One of them is good parenting, and it's especially important going through separation and after divorce for parents to provide loving, good parenting. The problem is that it's often very difficult to do because anger toward the other parent and conflict toward the other parent, we know diminishes the quality of parenting that's available to children. Parents are sort of more absorbed with their own stuff. They don't have as much time for their kids. They don't spend as much time with them. They're more harsh in their discipline. So what I'd like to say is that if parents see that things are kind of heading south in terms of not doing as well as they'd like to be doing, it's really good to take a parenting class to get some support from a counselor on a short-term basis. So good parenting is a protective buffer for children. Secondly, we know that high levels of conflict, particularly conflict that uses the child to express the dispute, where parents actively pull the child into the conflict. You tell your father that he's a blah, 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 or so, how many boyfriends does your mom have now, says dad. Those kinds of questions put the big squeeze on children, make them feel anxious and depressed. And so the message for parents is to leave your children out of your conflict, to wrap that conflict into this big bubble and use it, talk to their lawyers, their mediators, their therapists, but not to use their children to express their anger. That's a very protective factor. There are many things that parents can do to make this work out for their kids. And hopefully they will read some of the books. There are many books that are available. Actually, this booklet, What Should We Tell the Children?
Yeah.
The Parent's Guide for Talking About Separation and Divorce. In the back of that booklet, there's a very good list of books for parents and books for children of different ages, including adolescents and also software programs and so on. So the resources are out there, and when parents kind of help themselves and take divorce education programs, which many family courts offer, or that are offered in the community, it really improves things for children. And I think that's what all parents want, is that their children turn out well in the end and are not negatively affected by their separation or divorce.
Right. I'd also like to point out that parents who'd like to obtain this booklet can go to aaml.org.
AAML.org. That's right. The American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers.
And, for $10, it's an incredible investment.
It is. They can even buy more and get it cheaper and give it to their friends or their therapists. Yeah.
But it's a great message. I think that parents have to understand how important it is to tell their children that the world is going to change, and as much as it hurts to share that message that their parents are going to separate or divorce, it's critical that they tell their children. I mean, you want to give your children that sense of security.
That's exactly right. And I also know, Deborah, that you've developed a lot of materials that are helpful to parents.
Thank you.
Which are available
through the smartdivorce.com.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dr. Kelly, I want to thank you so much for your time. It's been really informative and educational.
Thank you. I hope that it is useful. Okay.
Good talking to you.
Thank you.
Wow, that was an incredible interview. I just hope that we're going to be able to increase the number of parents from 5% who tell their children about divorce to 95% or 100%. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, how about that 5%? That was surprising to hear.
It was shocking to me because when I went through my own divorce, I made sure that I got the guidance that I needed to tell my son was 7 at the time. My other two were 1 and 3. So how do I articulate that? I went to a parenting expert to help me develop this script because I was really at a loss. But I know that I needed to tell my son something.
Yeah, well, that's great.
And so in my own consulting practice, I always ask my clients where they are in the divorce process. And I do have clients that are that are cohabitating. So they're living together. And so they still need to see a lawyer when they're separating. So what do you do when you're separating or divorcing? So I ask them, do you have children? Yes. Have you told your children about the divorce? 99% of the time they haven't. Okay. And I send all of my clients to some kind of parenting expert because I want them to help. Number one, I need them to get help on developing that script for telling their children about the divorce and also on developing the parenting plan. It's interesting how many parents are not aware of a parenting plan, and a parenting plan is so critical. It helps the parents identify or establish what the parenting responsibilities are going to be, when the kids are going to be with each parent, if there are any issues on decision making, all that kind of thing. That's the stuff you need to start thinking about. If you don't think about it, if you don't work through it together, you're going to have more conflict.
Well, how do you get a parenting plan? What's the guide for that?
There's no right or wrong parenting plan. So what I would tell any individual that's not going to go to any kind of parenting expert, Google parenting plans. There's some great websites. Bob Emery on Divorce has something on his website, and just Google parenting plans. And you can see there's some great books. I've got in the Smart Divorce, I talk a lot about parenting plan, and I think if individuals buy the booklet that Dr. Kelly was referring to, again, go to aaml.org and get this booklet. She's got a lot of fabulous resources in terms of what you could do, and I even think she talks a little bit about what children need to do and what you say and what and reducing the conflict. So, that could help too. And I don't know that there's a lot on the parenting plan, but it certainly gives you something to think about.
Personally, I really do kind of like the idea of going before a counselor. Dr. Kelly kind of agreed if it was the right type of counselor, but it seems to me if you had this loving person that was there, it might not swing out of control.
I think it depends on your children, because if your children are very, very young, it's what's the stranger doing here? Or if your children are a little bit skeptical, why do we need a doctor?
Yeah, but the flip side of that, what do you do if your child becomes unconsolable? Now you're there and the kid is crying, hysterical, angry, and let's say you can't rein them back in. Now what?
I think that's a great point. Something I never really thought of, but that's a great, great point, which goes to the other point of how important it is to develop a script. Parents need to think about what they're going to say. You can't just call your kids into the family room for a meeting and say, okay, kids, your mom and dad, we're separating now, without having that thought through what you're going to actually say. Mm-hmm. kids are going to want to know why, where are we going to live? What about my friends? And let's face it, children are very self-centered. It's all about them.
Yeah, that's true. That's what we've learned, isn't it? That they just want to know that I'm going to still get to my baseball game. I'm still going to the same school. I'm still doing this. It's all about them.
And I love the example Dr. Kelly used on, who's going to take care of me? I mean, really, the kids want to know how the separation and divorce is going to affect them. And you really need to be prepared for that. So if you don't sit down and have a conversation with your soon-to-be co-parent, you're not going to be prepared for this. You're not going to give your kids a sense of security. I think that other message is we're divorcing each other, we're not divorcing you. If you're not prepared, they might get that impression also. Well, if mom and dad, and it looks like they love each other and now they're divorcing each other, well, what if I don't behave? What if, I act out? What if I do this? Does that mean they're going to divorce me too? So you really do need to give them a sense of security. And by thinking it through and developing a script and how you're going to manage this, I think it'll go years in helping the children cope with the divorce and the impact of divorce.
Well, great show, helpful to the listeners of The Smart Divorce. Thank you, Debbie. It's good to have you back. I know you were gone for a couple of weeks, enjoying your summer and running your family. So welcome back, and more shows, more great ones on the way, right?
We do have more great shows on the way, and we couldn't have started this season any better than with Dr. Joan Kelly. So, Steve, it's been a pleasure.
And if you'd like to contact us, you can write us at divorcesourceradio@gmail.com, or you can write our good friend Deborah Moskovitch direct. What's your email address?
info@thesmartdivorce.com.
And thesmartdivorce.com has all kinds of resources, including Deborah's best-selling book, The Smart Divorce. All right, Debbie, we'll see you next time on the Smart Divorce Radio Show on Divorce Source Radio. Have a good one.